Just because an anecdote is a good story doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good illustration. And a great illustration in one sermon doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a good one in another. There are several important questions you should ask before using a story in your sermon. First, how well does the story fit your point? Illustrations serve the sermon, not the other way around. Never make the sermon an occasion to tell a story just because it's a good story. Another dimension of this has to do with the relative weight of the illustration compared to the weight of the point it supports. The illustration shouldn't draw so much attention to itself that it distracts from the point that you are trying to make. Just as you wouldn't want to support a major point with a weak illustration, never squander a major illustration on a minor point. The illustration needs to suit your point. Second, does it move the sermon forward? In his book, Choosing to Preach, Kenton Anderson warns, an illustration is not just a breathing space in the sermon, as if it were only there to serve the same purpose as a television commercial, allowing the listener an opportunity to mentally go to the refrigerator. The purpose of the illustration is to move the sermon forward. Third, is it credible? The credibility of an illustration is a function of its accuracy. How accurate are you in your details? If your listeners know that your facts are wrong, your illustration loses credibility even if it's true. Don't manufacture stories and present them as if they were true unless the situation you're describing is clearly hypothetical. In this age of viral information, we also need to have a measure of skepticism about the stories we find on the internet. Try to verify the facts whenever you can. Fourth, is it clear? A sermon illustration has to be clear to you in order for it to be clear to your audience. You need to know the details of the story in order to tell it well, and you need to know why you're using the illustration in order to make the right application. But it's not enough for the illustration to be clear to you. Put yourself in the place of your listener. Will the illustration's point be equally clear to them? If you need to exegete the illustration in order for it to make sense to your hearers, it's not a good illustration. Fifth, is there variety in your illustrations? It's easy to fall into a predictable pattern with our illustrations by going to the same sources or using the same kind of illustrations in every sermon. This creates monotony rather than clarity. In the Moody Handbook of Preaching, Pam McCrae notes that when many pastors try to relate to women with illustrations, they generally use examples about mothering, homemaking, or being a wife. This is a good beginning, McCrae writes, but this is not the only and may not even be the most common life situation for the women in your church. Being a wife and mother is an important aspect of many women's lives, she explains, but typically it is a limited part. Other preachers seem to draw the majority of their illustrations from the sports world. Vary your examples and draw from multiple sources when you illustrate the sermon. Sixth, is it appropriate? Is the illustration appropriate for your listeners? One of the main functions of an illustration is to enable your audience to identify with the experience that you're describing. If your examples are too far removed from their cultural context, they're liable to have the opposite effect. An illustration about the farm may not be the best example to use for an urban congregation. A classic illustration from 19th century pulpit master Charles Spurgeon may not speak to listeners in the 21st century. In addition, do not offend your listeners unnecessarily by employing demeaning stereotypes. Whether or not an illustration is appropriate is a judgment made by the listener, not the speaker. We may be frustrated by this and be unwilling to subject our illustrations to the tastes of someone else. But if your illustration unnecessarily offends your listeners, they will not hear the rest of your message. Seventh, is it too self-focused? Today's listeners appreciate transparency in preaching, and they are naturally interested in the preacher's personal life. But this kind of environment, combined with the nature of public speaking, makes the pulpit a breeding ground for narcissism. Try not to make yourself the focus of all the sermon's illustrations. You shouldn't be the hero of all your stories, or the villain for that matter. Be transparent about your own struggle with the truth of the text, but be careful not to share more than is appropriate. The threshold between genuine transparency and emotional exhibitionism or narcissism can be a narrow one. Your aim is to direct attention to Christ, not draw it to yourself. Illustrating the sermon is hard work. You should be thinking about potential illustrations as you study the passage. It often helps to create an illustration file for the sermon, and keep on the lookout for good material when you're not in the study.
I find that one of the things that helps me the most is what Haddon has already referred to. I talk about having a pre-sermon file, that I try to know somewhat ahead of time what I am going to be preaching about, and that allows me to take pretty much everything coming into my life experience, an article in the paper, a word my child said to me on the way home from school, just take everything that's coming across my experience weeks ahead of time, and I don't try to organize it. I just throw it in that file. It has something I just throw it in that file. I always carry in my wallet a little set of cards. My students tease me about it, but I always a little something to jot down, and I'm jotting down thoughts. And my attempt is just to say, is there something that I have touched or has touched me that relates to that subject? I just get scared to death if I get into that Saturday night fever of, I preach tomorrow and I've got to come up with an illustration. My intention is really to have an abundance of illustrations related to that subject before I ever really form the sermon in a very precise way, because I've been just throwing material into that pre-sermon file. And it could be any number of things. Magazine articles read. It could be an exposure to something in the news, something that's right, something that's wrong in the world. And say that has some bearing on that event, and just throw it in the file so that it's there percolating before I get to it.
So another advantage of a preaching calendar, it enables you to attract to your file and ultimately to your sermon material that will help folks see the truth as it relates to their life and their experience.
I also have a topic file dealing with particular issues that particularly issues that are controversial, I want to keep up with. Abortion, gambling, things that are in the culture that are churning, and that I want to have lots of information at my fingertips when I come to address those subjects. Also have a Books of the Bible file where I throw information in that relates to different books of the Bible. I actually do have on computer my illustrations, so I've made that step.
You're younger.
But now, having said all that, let me now fess up. I'm often in the position with students saying, do as I say, not as I do. I recognize there are different times of my life where I'm much more diligent in getting those illustrations in, those various file systems, and other times in my life I'm not so diligent. The thing I want to stress, I suppose, that I never get less than diligent about is that pre-sermon file. Mm-hmm. What Haddon has said. When you know what's coming, and you can just put a number of sermons in order down the road somewhere, that I'm always very careful just to be throwing material into those files, even if I don't remember to put it in the larger computerized file. I don't forget to put it in the pre-sermon files. That just becomes essential to my work.